Buildings remember things people forget. Funeral homes remember more carefully than most, because the people who work inside them have learned to notice everything. Simeon Achebe had spent 29 years learning to notice everything inside Holloway Family Funeral Home, a converted 1911 residence that had served the grieving since 1958, with a small memorial chapel added as a purpose-built extension in 1972. He was 63 now, the building's facilities caretaker, responsible for the quiet physical labor that kept the place meant for mourning feeling calm rather than neglected. The floors, the fixtures, the small repairs nobody else thought to make until something finally broke. He had learned to care about that kind of attention from a man named Otto Vance, who had held Simeon's job for 26 years before him and who believed, without ever feeling the need to explain himself, that a building used for grief deserved the same careful watching a doctor give a patient. Simeon started at Holloway at 34, hired as Vance's assistant during a period when the funeral home's original owners were still running the business themselves, before it passed through 2 later ownership changes to arrive at the corporate group that managed it now. Vance was 59 and soft-spoken, deliberate in every motion, the kind of man who could stand in a doorway for a full minute without saying anything and somehow make that silence feel like careful thought rather than distraction. People notice everything in this building, Vance told him. During Simeon's second week, the two of them standing together in the quiet reflection room that opened into the chapel. They're grieving. Grief makes you notice things you'd normally walk past. A creaking floor, a cold draft, a door that doesn't sit right. If something's wrong here, somebody feels it, even if they can't say what it is. Vance kept a small ledger, not a maintenance log in the ordinary sense, but a private record he called the building's small behaviors, a phrase he used without any embarrassment at all, as though it were simply an accurate description of what he was doing. Water stains that reappeared in the same spot every spring. A window in the family room that fogged differently than the others in winter. A floorboard near the chapel entrance that had always creaked at exactly the same point in someone's step, regardless of who was walking. A radiator in the east parlor that ticked twice before it ever produced heat, every single time. For reasons Vance had never bothered to chase down, because it never seemed to matter. Simeon remembered asking him once, early on, why he bothered recording things that didn't seem to need fixing. Vance had looked at him for a long moment, the way he looked at doorways before touching them, and said that a building spoke in more than just its failures. Sometimes it spoke in its habits. And you couldn't always tell, at the time you first noticed something, whether it was a habit or an early warning, wearing a habit's disguise. When Vance retired, he left Simeon the ledger, along with a single piece of advice Simeon had carried for 29 years since. Write it down even when you don't understand it. Understanding comes later, if it comes at all. Writing it down is the only part you can control. The chapel's north side door had a particular kind of trouble that Simeon came to know intimately over the decades, a door used by family members entering from the private reflection room, before service began, meant to open quietly and close with firm, reassuring latch that told everyone inside the room was settled and the service could proceed. Families waiting in the reflection room listened for that sound, without realizing they were listening for it. A soft click meant it was time, meant the room was ready, meant the next difficult thing could begin. It had never latched reliably, not from the day the 1972 extension was completed, as far as anyone at Holloway could determine. It had been adjusted, rehung on new hinges, and eventually replaced entirely with a completely new door and frame assembly sometime in the 1980s, long before Simeon's arrival. None of it had fully solved the problem. Funeral directors over the decades had developed their own quiet workaround, learning to push the door firmly closed with their shoulder rather than trust the latch alone, a habit so ingrained that new staff picked it up within their first few services without ever being told why. Vance's earliest entry about it, dated 1979, read, "North door won't hold latch again. 3rd time this fall. Carpenter says frame is true. Hinges are sound. Always autumn and winter. Never summer." Written down because someone should know this isn't new. Simeon had read that entry during his first year with the ledger, sitting in the small maintenance office tucked behind the chapel's mechanical room, and it felt something settle into place that he wouldn't fully understand for years. Vance had noticed something real. Vance had never solved it. And Vance had kept writing it down anyway, patient enough to preserve a pattern he never got to finish explaining. Simeon continued Vance's seasonal tracking almost by instinct, checking the north door each autumn as the weather turned, noting whenever it failed to hold its latch and whenever it didn't. The pattern held exactly as Vance had described it. Cold months, the door struggled. Warm months, it behaved like any ordinary door in the building. He had assumed, in his early years, that this was simply one of those small, permanent oddities every old building carried. The kind of thing you learn to live with rather than solve, since two separate carpenters across two separate decades had already confirmed the frame and hinges were sound. It took him considerably longer to notice that the pattern wasn't staying the same. In his 14th year with the ledger, reviewing 2 decades of his own more careful notes against Vance's earlier, simpler ones, Simeon saw that the door's failure rate each winter had been slowly climbing. Not dramatically, not in any single season that would have alarmed him at the time, but laid out across enough years, the trend was unmistakable. The door failed to latch more often each winter than it had the winter before, a slow, compounding pattern that neither man's individual observations could have shown clearly on their own. He sat with that realization for a long time one November evening, alone in the small maintenance office, the ledger open on the desk in front of him, the chapel beyond the wall dark and silent between services. The building always felt different in these quiet hours. The way any place built for solemn occasions feels different once the occasion is past, and only the structure remains, holding whatever weight had been placed on it during the day. He pulled out every entry Vance had ever written about the north door, laying the ledger pages open in order across the desk, watching the observations accumulate across 2.5 decades of one careful man's attention. Vance had never pushed for an answer. He had simply kept noticing, season after season, adding a line here and there whenever the pattern reasserted itself, never growing frustrated that the explanation refused to arrive. If the trend held as far back as Vance's earliest entry, something behind that door had been quietly, patiently worsening for over 40 years, and neither of them had ever understood why. He wrote his own note beneath Vance's original entry, in the same understated hand Vance had modeled for him. 2 decades of tracking confirmed the failure rate is not stable. It is increasing slowly every winter, 'cause still unknown. Continuing to watch. He underlined continuing. It felt like the only honest word available to him. Simeon had a theory, in his 18th year, that the door's behavior might simply be tied to humidity rather than temperature. With swelling in damp winter air, the kind of seasonal wood movement that affected doors in older homes throughout the region regardless of any deeper structural cause. He spent the better part of winter tracking humidity readings alongside the door's latch failures, carefully logging conditions on days the door held and days it didn't, convinced he had finally found an explanation simple enough to address with better weather stripping and a properly sealed frame. The humidity data didn't correlate. Some of the driest winter days produced latch failures just as reliably as the most humid ones. Whatever was affecting the door wasn't responding to moisture in the air at all. It was responding to something else entirely, something that happened to arrive alongside cold weather without actually being caused by it. He had been wrong. He wrote it plainly in the ledger, in the same unembellished style Vance had taught him without ever meaning to teach a lesson. Humidity theory. Ruled out. No correlation between moisture readings and latch failure. Causes not related to its swelling from dampness. Back to unexplained. It bothered him more than most of his wrong guesses did. He had wanted the humidity explanation to be correct. It was clean, fixable with materials he already knew how to install, the kind of finding that let a person close a question instead of carrying it forward another decade. Being wrong meant the cause lived somewhere Simeon's usual tools couldn't easily reach. Not in the door itself, not in the moisture in the air, but somewhere in the structure surrounding the doorway. The renovation announcement arrived in his 27th year. Holloway's newer ownership group, having acquired the funeral home 3 years earlier as part of regional expansion, approved a renovation to modernize the chapel and reflection room into a single climate-sealed suite, a project intended to improve energy efficiency and create a more unified space for families before services. The plan called for removing the north door and its frame entirely, widening the opening into a single code-compliant doorway between the 2 rooms, eliminating the persistent latch problem simply by eliminating the latch. Simeon read the project brief and felt an old unease resurface. If his theory about the door was tied to something in the surrounding structure rather than the door itself, removing the door wouldn't fix anything. It would simply remove the only physical indicator that had been showing faithfully for over 40 years that something behind that wall wasn't behaving the way the building's original construction assumed it would. He brought Vance's ledger, along with his own 2 decades of continued tracking, to the renovation contractor overseeing the project. The contractor, a careful man named Holloway, reviewed the door frame's most recent structural inspection and found it entirely sound. True level, showing no signs of the kind of decay or settling that would typically explain a persistent latching problem. "The frame's fine," Holloway said, examining the doorway during a site walkthrough with Simeon. "Old doors settle unevenly sometimes, especially in a building this age. It's common enough that I wouldn't read too much into it. Once we widen this opening and install the new seal system, the latch problem goes away entirely, because there won't be a door here anymore to have the problem." "The pattern isn't random," Simeon said. "It's seasonal. It's been getting worse every winter for over 40 years. I don't think removing the door fixes whatever's actually causing that pattern. I think it just removes the one thing that's been telling us about it." Holloway considered this, and to his credit, didn't dismiss it outright. "I understand concern," he said, "but I don't have structural justification to investigate a wall assembly based on an old door's latch history, when the door and frame themselves have already been inspected and found sound twice over the decades. The new design accounts for standard seasonal movement in a building this age. I think it'll be fine." It was a reasonable position, and Simeon didn't have a competing structural credential to argue against it directly. What it was 45 years of a pattern that had outlasted 2 separate repairs and a ruled-out humidity theory, and a growing conviction that the door had been trying to describe something the frame inspections were never designed to catch. Simeon didn't sleep well through the weeks that followed. He kept circling back to an uncomfortable question he couldn't fully resolve. Where Holloway was right, and 45 years of a door failing to latch in winter really was nothing more than an ordinary quirk of old construction, the kind of thing every century-old building eventually developed somewhere. He had wanted for years for the worsening pattern to connect to something structurally real, something significant enough to justify the quiet attention he and Vance together had poured into 2 combined careers of careful, seasonal observation. Wanting it to matter wasn't the same as it actually mattering. He pulled Vance's oldest ledger entry out one more evening, sitting alone in the small maintenance office with a single desk lamp lit, and reread the 1979 note slowly. Written down, because someone should know this isn't new. Vance had never known what caused it either. He had simply kept writing it down year after year, trusting that the pattern itself was worth preserving even without an explanation attached to it. Simeon had inherited that same trust without ever fully testing whether it held up against a contractor's confident assessment of a structurally sound door frame. He didn't have the cause confirmed yet, but not having it hadn't stopped Vance from writing the first entry in 1979. It was a reason for Simeon to stop pushing now, with the door about to be removed entirely and the wall around it sealed behind new construction. He requested, at his own initiative, a single afternoon with a structural specialist before the renovation began. Not to delay the project. He made clear, only to understand what was happening around that doorway before the opportunity to examine it properly disappeared along with the door itself. The specialist was a woman named Priya Anand, who studied how older residential additions settled against original foundations over time. She reviewed Holloway's 1911 and 1972 construction records alongside Simeon's decades of seasonal tracking, and she brought precision movement sensors to monitor the doorway frame's actual behavior through a cold snap that November. What she found, confirmed with follow-up measurements 2 weeks later during milder weather, explained 45 years of a pattern nobody had ever been able to name. The 1972 chapel extension had been built directly against the original 1911 residence's foundation, connected by a shared wall that had never been properly isolated with an expansion joint, a common oversight when additions were built quickly onto older homes during that era. Seasonal ground temperature changes caused the original 1911 foundation to contract slightly more than the newer 1972 structure beside it, a small but genuine differential movement transmitted through the shared wall. This doorway frame is caught right at the seam between two foundations that move differently from each other, Priya explained to Simeon, reviewing her measurements afterward. Every winter, as the ground cools, the older foundation pulls slightly more than the newer one. That difference racks the frame just enough to prevent the latch from seating properly. It's subtle, it's not dangerous, but it's real, and it's been slowly getting worse as both foundations continue settling at their own separate rates. And the wider opening they're planning? Simeon asked. Would sit across exactly the same seam. Priya said, a bigger doorway assembly doesn't fix a foundation that moves unevenly. It just gives the same seasonal racking a larger, more expensive structure to work against. If this renovation is meant to create a sealed climate boundary between the two rooms, that seam is precisely where a seal is most likely to eventually fail. Simeon thought about Vance's oldest entry, written decades before either of them had the equipment to see what was actually happening underground. Written down because someone should know this isn't new. Vance had been right in the most literal way possible. The door hadn't been misbehaving on its own. It had simply been sitting at the one point in the entire building where two separate foundations disagreed with each other every winter, quietly and repeatedly, in a language only a stubborn latch could speak. So, the door was never really the problem, Simeon said. The door was the only thing telling you there was a problem, Priya said. Everything else about this building has been designed and inspected to standard. Nobody ever had a reason to look at how these two foundations interact, because nothing else in the structure was positioned to notice. Priya's findings went to the renovation committee within the week. Reese Calloway reviewed her full report personally and called Simeon afterward. You were right to push for this, Calloway said. I was working from an inspection standard that checks the door and frame, not the foundation seam underneath them. If we built a new opening without addressing that, we have been creating a much bigger, much more expensive version of the exact same problem, right at the point where the new climate seal depends on everything staying still. The renovation was revised. An expansion joint was properly installed along the shared wall for the first time in the building's history, isolating the two foundations from each other, so their differential movement could no longer transmit through to the doorway. The new, wider opening was built afterward, its seal designed to accommodate the small remaining seasonal movement rather than ignored entirely. Holloway's facilities office filed a formal note in its permanent records, crediting both Otto Vance's original 1979 observation and Simeon's 2 decades of continued tracking as the reason the structural condition had been identified and properly addressed before the renovation sealed it behind permanent construction. Simeon kept Vance's ledger. He added a final entry of his own before finally moving it from his own desk drawer into the funeral home's administrative archive. Foundation seemed isolated with proper expansion joint. This year, original condition traced to an unisolated 1972 addition, documented informally through door behavior since 1979. New opening built to accommodate seasonal movement rather than resist it. Otto, you were right that this building was telling us something. Neither of us knew what for a very long time. He stood near the new opening on a quiet December morning, the first full winter after repair, watching the space where the old north door used to be. There was nothing to latch anymore, no small mechanical failure to check for, just an open, wider passage between two rooms, calm and steady, exactly as it was meant to feel for families walking through it before service. He thought about Vance, standing in the same spot decades earlier, telling a nervous new hire that people notice everything in a place built for grief, even the things they can't quite name. Simeon had carried that lesson through 29 years, through a ruled-out humidity theory, to a season of genuine doubt about whether careful attention had ever amounted to anything more than an old man's stubborn habit. He hadn't needed to understand the cause immediately. He had only needed to keep watching, the way Vance had taught him, until the building finally explained itself to someone patient enough to listen through 45 winters instead of one.